I had always prided myself on being a loyal wife, someone who would never betray the love I shared with my husband. We had our ups and downs, sure, but I never thought I'd be the kind of person to step out on him. I believed in commitment, in the bond we had built over the years. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs at you when you least expect it. I found myself in a place I never thought I'd be, in a relationship that felt more like a routine than something full of passion and connection. The excitement of our early days had faded into familiarity, and I couldn't deny that I was feeling disconnected from him. Our conversations had become routine, and the spark we once shared seemed to have dimmed. It wasn't just that there were moments when I felt alone, even when he was beside me. We weren't arguing, but it felt like something was missing. One evening, after another long day of feeling emotionally distant, I went for a walk. The house felt suffocating, and I needed to clear my head. The weather was gloomy, and the rain began to fall as I stepped outside. There was something oddly soothing about the rhythm of the rain hitting the pavement, the way it seemed to wash away everything around me. I wasn't looking for anything that night, definitely not for someone else to come into my life, but it felt like the world was just quiet enough for me to hear myself think. The raindrops seemed to blur everything around me, and for once I could breathe without feeling the weight of expectation or the pressure of the life I had been living. I kept walking, trying to make sense of the frustration and loneliness that had been building up inside me. That's when I saw him. He was standing under the bus stop, his figure outlined against the gray backdrop of the storm. He was tall, with a strong presence that I couldn't ignore. Something about him caught my attention, and I couldn't seem to look away. There was an undeniable pull, like the universe had orchestrated our meeting in this very moment. He looked at me, not with pity or curiosity, but with something deeper, something that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in so long. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. I couldn't explain it, but I was drawn to him in a way that made my heart race. We started talking, and it felt so easy, like we had known each other forever. For the first time in ages, I felt an emotional connection with someone who wasn't my husband. There was an energy between us, and the rain, the cold, the night, it all seemed to push us closer. I never expected it, but I couldn't stop myself. I didn't want to. The guilt didn't hit me then. It was like I was caught in the moment, and it felt almost too perfect to be wrong. It was a stormy evening, and I was out for a walk, needing to clear my mind. The cold raindrops hit my skin, but I didn't mind. It felt almost refreshing. The weight of everything in my life seemed to be pressing down on me, and I was desperate for an escape, even if just for a little while. I wasn't looking for anything to change, but something about the night made me feel like it was the right moment for a shift. The world around me felt muffled, as though the rain had quieted everything else, and I could finally hear my own thoughts without the constant noise of my everyday life. It was a strange sensation, almost as if I had entered another world where nothing mattered. That's when I met him. He was standing by the bus stop, his figure dark against the rain-soaked streets. I wasn't sure why, but something about the way he looked made me feel like I had just crossed paths with someone who had a different energy from anyone I had ever known. He wasn't just any stranger. There was something magnetic about him, something that pulled me in without warning. He stood there in the rain, calm and composed, as if he were unaffected by the weather or the world around him. It was impossible not to notice him. His presence felt strong, yet there was a quietness about him that contrasted sharply with the chaos inside me. He seemed like a person who had his own world, one that didn't require permission to exist. I was drawn to him in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just physical. There was something in the way he looked at me, something in the unspoken connection that formed between us. I had no idea who he was, but in that moment he felt familiar in a way that was almost comforting. We exchanged a few words, simple things about the weather, and suddenly the conversation didn't seem important anymore. What mattered was the way I felt when I was standing there, in the rain with him. It wasn't like anything I had felt with my husband in a long time. It was new, exciting, and raw. The more we talked, the more I found myself letting go of the walls I had built up over time. I didn't even realize it, but I was starting to feel alive again, like the person I had once been. Before I knew it, the rain had become a backdrop to the intimacy we were building, and I found myself stepping away from the world I knew. He wasn't a stranger anymore, he was someone I wanted to be closer to. The boundaries of the world I had lived in seemed to blur. The rain, the cold, the night, it felt like a secret world where nothing mattered except what was happening in that moment. I didn't think about the consequences, I just acted on instinct. And as we moved closer, I knew that something irreversible was happening. I didn't stop it. In fact, I welcomed it, as if the rain had washed away all my reservations. I never thought I could do something like that. The aftermath of that night was a whirlwind of emotions. When I woke up the next morning, I felt ashamed, confused, and disgusted with myself. I couldn't believe I had done that to my husband, the person I had promised to love and be faithful to. Every time I looked at him after that, I felt the weight of the secret pressing down on me. How could I look him in the eye, knowing what I had done? How could I act like everything was normal when I knew the truth? My stomach churned every time we were in the same room, and it felt like there was a wall between us that hadn't been there before. I convinced myself it was a one-time mistake, that I was just confused and lonely, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The guilt gnawed at me constantly, lingering in the background of every conversation, every touch, every moment we shared. I kept telling myself I could move past it, that I could pretend like nothing had happened, but the more I tried to ignore it, the louder it became. The rain that night, everything, it felt like it had been a turning point, one I couldn't undo. I had crossed a line I never thought I'd cross, and now I was left to face the consequences of my actions. What hurt the most was knowing that my husband trusted me completely. He had never given me a reason to doubt his love, and yet there I was, betraying him in the most intimate way possible. I didn't want to hurt him. I never intended for it to go that far, but in a moment of weakness I had given in to temptation. The more I thought about it, the more I hated myself for being so reckless, for allowing myself to lose control. It wasn't just about the physical act, though. It was the emotional betrayal that haunted me. I had let someone else into my life in a way that should have only been reserved for my husband. I had allowed myself to connect with someone else when I had promised to be his. I tried to bury it, to act like everything was okay, but I couldn't. The guilt became a constant companion, following me through every day. I found myself pulling away from my husband without meaning to. It wasn't his fault, but I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. It was as if that night had changed me, and I wasn't sure who I was anymore. The shame, the regret, it suffocated me, and yet I couldn't bring myself to tell him the truth. I was stuck in a cycle of lies and self-loathing, wondering if I'd ever be able to live with myself again. I couldn't escape the flashbacks. It was as if the rain had washed away all my barriers, and everything I had been holding back rushed forward. The moments with him replayed in my mind over and over and over, each detail etched into my memory, as vivid as the storm itself. His touch, the way he held me, the way it felt to be with someone so different from my husband, it haunted me. Every time I tried to focus on my family, on my life, I found my mind drifting back to that night. It was like an itch I couldn't scratch, a memory that wouldn't let me go. I tried to suppress it, to convince myself that I was over it, but the more I tried to forget, the more the images of him seemed to invade my thoughts. It wasn't just the physical intimacy, it was the connection we shared in that moment. It was raw, unfiltered, and it made me feel things I hadn't felt in so long. I had always been so careful, so controlled, but with him I had let go. And that scared me, because deep down I realized I missed that feeling, being wanted, desired, and seen in a way that had nothing to do with the responsibilities of life. When I looked at my husband, I saw the man I had promised to love forever, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I was missing something. What had I lost in myself? What had I sacrificed in trying to maintain the life I had built with him? The nights I had spent lying next to him, pretending everything was fine, were growing harder to endure. It wasn't that I didn't love him, because I did, or at least I thought I did. But I couldn't deny the emotional distance I had been feeling for so long. The rain, the night, it felt like a secret world I had entered, one where I had been reminded of a side of myself that I had long buried. The guilt gnawed at me every time I thought about him, the man who had stepped into my life for one night and left a permanent mark on me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was carrying a piece of him with me, even as I tried to push it away. The touch of his hands, the way his voice sounded in the midst of the storm, those things didn't fade. And that made it worse, because I wasn't sure how to reconcile what had happened with the life I was supposed to be living. I had betrayed my husband, and yet I was struggling with the part of me that had been awakened that night. The flashbacks made me question who I was, who I had become, and whether I could ever forgive myself for what I had done. The guilt and shame reached their peak, and I knew I couldn't keep living this lie. I couldn't pretend everything was fine anymore. I had to face what I had done, not just to my husband, but to myself. That rainy night was a turning point, not just in my marriage, but in how I viewed myself. I had betrayed the person who trusted me the most, and now I was left to pick up the pieces of my broken conscience. I didn't know what was next, but I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't carrying the weight of my actions. The lies, the deceit, they had consumed me, and I realized I was no longer the person I used to be. I avoided looking my husband in the eye. It became almost unbearable to see him going about his life, trusting me completely, while inside I was crumbling. I felt like a stranger in my own home, like I was playing a role I no longer understood. Every conversation felt like a performance, every touch felt empty. The distance between us wasn't just physical, it had become emotional too. I had built walls around myself, walls that were too high to tear down without revealing the truth. But the truth was terrifying. The truth was that I had made a mistake that I couldn't undo, and I wasn't sure if I could ever rebuild what I had broken. I had spent so much time convincing myself that what happened that night didn't matter, that it was just a moment of weakness, but the longer I tried to ignore it, the more I realized it wasn't something I could brush aside. I had hurt my husband in a way that went beyond what words could express. What scared me the most was the thought that maybe it was too late to fix things. Maybe the trust between us had already been shattered beyond repair. But even worse, I began to wonder if I could ever fix myself. Could I ever look at myself in the mirror again without feeling disgusted by what I had done? I wasn't sure if I could go on like this, hiding the truth, living in a constant state of regret. I knew I had to make a decision. I had to be honest, not just with my husband, but with myself. But how could I? How could I explain what had happened when I wasn't even sure I understood it myself? That night in the rain, with him, it had awakened something inside me, something I wasn't ready to confront. But I had to. I had to face it. I had to face what I had done, even if it meant losing everything. Because deep down, I knew I couldn't keep living with the lies. The rain, the passion, the connection, it was all still there in my mind, but it wasn't worth losing the life I had built. The reckoning was inevitable, and all I could do was brace myself for the consequences.